Case-Blau and Stalingrad is Hitler's absolute last chance of winning the war. He even says, "If I do not get the oil of Mayakop and Grozny, then I must end the war." And he was right. Fuel too was in such short supply that the Wehrmacht High Command in 1942 cut the fuel ration to the Austheer considerably, a blow to its mobility accentuated by the serious loss of horses. The OKW warns in June of 1942 that the army will have no choice but to partially demotorise.
Again, let's just re-emphasize that about 80% of the German army wasn't motorized. There were a lot of reasons for having less available, and horses was just as much a problem, if not more so, because there were a lot more infantry divisions that relied on horses.
Tank numbers were greater in 1942 than in 1941, and again in 1943 compared to 1942. The problem is that they don't have enough petrol to run the ones that they've got already. Tellingly, at a time when the Soviets were rapidly rebuilding and mechanising their forces.
Yeah, okay, the Soviet armed forces of World War II were equally non-mechanized. The bulk of the army did not have motorized transport or anything really. They were infantry divisions. For the most part, they were infantry divisions with a lot of guys walking, and supplies being provided by carts as much as anything. And that was true up till 1945.
Modernisation of the Austheer did not bode well, given that the success of the campaign depending on seizing objectives more than 800 miles from the German start line, an operational and logistic challenge greater than that of the previous summer.
And here's an interesting point that very few people talk about. The Soviet force distribution expected another attack on Moscow, which meant that they were literally inviting Germans to try, expecting to stop them. And if the Germans had done that, it's certainly a lower probability of success than in 1941. But it's an interesting, what if they went for Moscow a second time. Given the performance of Soviet forces against the German forces arrayed for Case-Blau, you have to kind of wonder if the Soviets had yet absorbed the lessons of warfare necessary to counter a blitzkrieg offensive. All indications are that they were getting there, but they weren't there yet.
Lots of people, including historians, say that the Germans were aiming for Baku. The Germans don't actually need to take Baku, they just need to take Mayakop and Grozny. And technically, they do get to them, but they only managed to extract 750 tons of crude oil from them per month before they're forced back. But this is Hitler's last chance. He's now...
See, again, that's the silliness of the secure the economic objectives position, is that it's going to take quite a while to actually bring those raw resources online for Germany. And yet the argument basically keeps hovering around that oil is running short, they can't do anything. But they obviously are able to get all the way to the Caucasus. As stunning as that may be, because frankly, that is far away. It's Azerbaijan in modern terms, right? So, that's where you're headed.
At war with Britain and the Soviet Union, which is bad enough as it is, but he's also now at war with the United States, the leading oil power of the world. America's trucks, tanks, planes, trains. They sent a lot of trains to the Soviet Union, which may have been more important than the trucks they sent, and vast quantities of other equipment. Well, they're on their way. And unlike the Germans, the Allies have the fuel to run them. It's just a matter of time. Hitler knows this, and knows his only chance to fight against the material superiority that's heading his way is to capture the oil in the Caucasus. If he gets the oil, his economy will be saved, and he would have the resources of continental Europe at his disposal. He would have the fuel to motorise and mechanise his army, and the panzers would have the fuel they need to actually fight.
This position just really doesn't make sense. I mean, it's as if there's no instant, capture the fields and you're done, and you can mechanize your army. It's like, first of all, I mean, it's a huge army, right? I mean, let's keep some perspective. It is a huge army, and most of it isn't mechanized, and therefore the resources it requires are actually quite different. Horses, carts. This argument basically sort of paints a picture that, oh, if you can only get oil, everything is going to change. It's like, well, not really, because it's not the bulk of the army.
Krieg would be back on, but he only has a narrow window of opportunity to take the oil. This is why it was vitally important that the Caucasus be taken in 1942, and why the Stalingrad campaign is important too. There's two aspects to this plan of Hitler's as well. The first is to get the oil at Mayakop and Grozny. The second is to cut the Soviets off from Baku. Now, he can't get to Baku, but what he can do is block the Volga. Perhaps they shouldn't have gone into the city of Stalingrad, but sat south of it on the Volga and just prevented the oil tankers from heading north. And, we'll leave the tactical decisions behind this debate for another day. But if the Germans cut the Volga, the Soviet Union would be crippled. The loss of the Caucasus would deprive the Soviet Union of half of its oil reserves and 80 to 90% of its crude oil production, refinery output and pipeline capacity. Meanwhile, severing the transit lines along the Volga would eliminate the most effective means of moving oil to central Russia from either the Caucasus, covering a distance of 1,200 kilometers on average to reach its domestic consumers, or the Volga, Urals, the second Baku. Without oil.
Yeah, again, I mean, the Soviet Union isn't that dependent on oil to keep functioning any more than the Germans are, because the bulk of their army isn't mechanized. Again, outside of the United States, there were no mechanized armies in World War II. The American experience was unique, in a sense. So I don't see how you can focus on oil, that somehow or other it's like, oh, if you cut off the Caucasus, if the Germans take the Caucasus and hold them and block the Volga, this is going to do what? I mean, Germany, without ever having acquired any additional oil reserves other than the synthetic fuel plants, fought on for years. I don't see how you can argue that, well, somehow or other the Soviet Union is going to just fall apart if this plan is actually. I mean, it's this argument that Hitler's logic here makes sense, and Hitler's logic makes sense if you're fighting a war of attrition. And if you're fighting a war of attrition, you're not going to win, because you're literally arrayed against a set of forces that, in GDP terms are in excess of 2 to 1. You're overmatched, and you have no chance of winning that. Your only hope is a quick victory that secures huge resources that then make the prospect of an over-channel invasion daunting.
Oil, and without food, and by the way, the Soviets were getting hungry already thanks to the loss of the Ukraine, the Soviet war effort would be in a dire situation. The
Soviet war effort was in a dire situation in 1942. The British in particular feared that they'd go for a peace, give the Germans a significant chunk of what they were looking for. And I mean, the Americans also had their questions. And I mean, that's because, Stalin, was part of the group of people who was willing to go along with making peace with the Germans and Austro-Hungarians in World War I. So again, it's like this is a period where things are very tense, and it's they've taken a massive hit to their economy. They don't really trust the Western allies, so there's good reason to believe there's a chance that Stalin's willing to negotiate a peace and let the Western allies fight on by themselves.
This would have given Hitler the oil he needed to keep fighting and deprive the Soviets of the oil and food they needed to fight effectively.
Okay, again, Hitler must have that oil in order to keep fighting. But the history says that they kept fighting anyway. They managed to keep fighting for years, and they were actually being successful in a period where, if we recall, we're supposed to have run out of oil and run out of the capacity to fight, but they carry out a massive campaign with an army group nonetheless the following year, and are quite successful. And so again, it leads to that question of, it's like, well, maybe they should have gone for Moscow in 1942. I mean, it's a gamble, but I mean, the entire war with the Soviet Union was a gamble. Hitler acknowledged that. You have to think to yourself, it makes more sense to at least try for a quick victory than to try to prepare for a hopeless two-front war.
Germany would have been placed in the best position, the best chance of winning, if they'd taken the Caucasus and cut the Volga. This was Hitler's last real gamble. This is why the Stalingrad campaign is a turning point.
See, again, Hitler's not gambling. Hitler's preparing for a war of attrition. I mean, he's basically, must secure resources. That's not going to help you win. That's pretty much guaranteeing your ultimate defeat, because the resources arrayed against you are overwhelming.
Hitler had won this fight in 1942, it's likely that the Soviets would have collapsed in 1943-1944. German economic assessments of the Soviet Union's precarious economic situation in early 1942 also had some merit. The Soviet economy was in fact on the verge of collapse due to the loss of numerous economic and raw materials assets during Operation Barbarossa. Moreover, the Soviet Union was already dependent by 1942 on Lend-Lease assistance, especially food and specialty petroleum products such as high-octane gasoline. Consequently, there is every reason to think that the loss of the Caucasus would have rendered the Red Army combat ineffective within a year.
Obviously not, right? I mean, let's again put perspective here. If the Germans are so desperately short on oil and manage to fight for years, then what's the logic that says somehow or other the Soviets aren't going to keep fighting for years, regardless? And Lend-Lease is providing them aid as well. I mean, in 1942 it's pretty meager, but there is aid coming from the Western Allies.
Cutting the oil route north would mean that the Red Army would barely have enough reserves of oil to wage war in 1943, and probably would have paralysed what remained of Soviet agriculture production. And Stalin knows this as well. He tells Deputy Oil Commissar Nikolai Beerpikov that if he doesn't destroy the oil fields before the Germans capture them, he would be shot. The Soviets therefore ensured that the oil fields are destroyed, so thoroughly in fact that even the Germans were impressed by the effort they went to do it. The issue with the 1942 campaign was that, well, it's of distance. The Germans simply don't have enough men and equipment to do the task. Effectively, the Germans and Axis allied forces are not capable of what was needed, and they are defeated. When you read the accounts of German panzer formations advancing in this campaign, you hear how they keep running out of fuel.
Well, yeah, because the distances are enormous and logistics is a challenge. Every army faces this problem, even today. Certainly, if you're advancing quickly, which the Germans certainly were in 1942, it becomes a challenge because it takes time to fix things, and so it slows down the movement of supplies. I just don't understand why so much emphasis is being put on, well, they constantly have to slow down. I mean, the Americans had to do that on, I think, more than one occasion after D-Day, because the American army was literally all mechanized. The logistical requirements of continuing to fuel the army simply at times weren't adequate. There's nothing, it doesn't say you're running out of oil in the sense of that there's no oil left. It just says that the supplies can't keep up with your advance, much like the marching infantry couldn't keep up with the motorized panzer grenadiers. Just, you know.
This means their attack on Stalingrad, for example, is often a stop-start affair, as they're waiting for more fuel to catch up to them. Yes, logistics does play its part, but actually a lot of it is simply the fact that the Germans have run out of fuel. Now, some of you will be thinking that Germany carried on the war until 1945 and that its economy didn't collapse because of a lack of oil resulting from not capturing the Caucasus.
It's really good that he's actually addressing some of the obvious objections, and let's just see how he does it and see what there is.
This is true, but that doesn't mean they weren't chronically short of oil.
Yeah, they were chronically short of oil, but is that sufficient condition for defeat? And I guess that's really what the fundamental question here, because if you're going to make a bold claim like the main reason the Germans lost was because of a lack of oil, then you have to make the case that somehow or other oil was the be-all, end-all of this war. And that's a pretty difficult position to defend.
Synthetic fuel allowed Germany to wage war but not to win it. Germany's economically illiterate generals scoffed at economic advisors.
I think he quotes Hitler saying the same kind of thing. You don't understand economics, to the German generals. And the thing is, it's like, well, it's not a war. It's not supposed to be a war of economics. It's supposed to be a rapid campaign aimed at a political victory, which ends up securing massive resources.
Who urged the conquest of the Caucasus by pointing out that Germany managed to carry on the war until 1945 without ever securing the Caucasus oil. But at no point after the failures of 1941-42 did Germany ever possess the opportunity to end the war on favourable terms.
Sure. And that is understandable because they were then fighting a war of attrition with the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain all arrayed against them. And there wasn't really much of a possibility that they could win that after 1942. It's why 42 is kind of, you know, and the defeat of Stalingrad is pretty much the marker that most people will point at as that's the turning point, and the popular confirmation point is the Battle of Kursk, which goes nowhere. But again, I mean, it's just a harsh reality that they can fight on, sure, but you saying, like, the argument that has been crafted in this video is basically saying they were running out of fuel in 1941, and yet they're still fighting and they're still advancing in 1942. So that's kind of something that's just not really resolved. And it's like, oh, but they have less material capability in 1942. It's like, well, yeah, in a sense they do, but they've lost a lot of equipment. They have to make that equipment up, and frankly, the German war economy was a joke until it was rationalized. It had been a mess, and they really weren't producing a lot. I mean, as a matter of fact, if I recall, the Germans were literally preparing to wind down armaments production in 1941. And they were that confident that this would all be resolved. So, yeah, there's lots of reasons why things were going bad.
Rather, Axis Europe had to spend the rest of the conflict labouring under constant shortage of energy, which constrained economic productivity and reduced military effectiveness.
Okay, economic productivity seems to have kept increasing until 1944. And it's rare to find anybody talking about, how oil was constraining this. It just doesn't ring convincing.
Hayward also points out that the German economy didn't collapse and that even some of the economic reports about the lack of oil were a little bit exaggerated. However, there are reasons the Germans continue to fight. Italy defected to the Allies, so the Germans...
Okay, I'm not sure how Italy defecting to the Allies encourages Germany to continue fighting, but okay.
Captured Italian oil reserves.
Okay, those would have been insignificant.
Also ramped up synthetic oil production, which helped massively, although...
Okay, finally, I don't recall him mentioning this before, but yeah, synthetic fuel, making gasoline out of coal. The Germans were massively increasing that production. Basically from 1940 onward, and it peaked in, believe it or not, 1944, and it collapsed once the Americans and the British started bombing it, which is in May 1944. And that's when you start hearing the real talk about shortages again. I mean, you hear about fuel shortages among combat troops at that time, after that. Other critical events from 1944, of course, is the loss of the Romanian oil fields because, well, Romania quits the war and is overrun by the Soviets.
Was never going to be enough. They're also fighting a mostly defensive war at this point, so fuel isn't getting used as much.
Okay, that I'm not clear about. Like, the amount of fuel you're going to use is dependent on how much mechanized forces you have, because offensive actions take movement as well. It's so I'm not really clear on that point, but I feel like I'm nitpicking.
There's also a reduction in the number of fighting vehicles. Some Luftwaffe training regimes were closed because of a lack.
That is true. The training of pilots was curtailed as a result of shortages. But again, I'm not sure of the date lines here. There was a paper written by an American about that. But I'm not sure how significant it is to this argument, though.
Lack of fuel, and the Luftwaffe as a whole was suffering from a chronic lack of fuel. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were relying on capturing Allied fuel stocks.
Okay, yeah, but that's like the end of 1944 into January 1945. There's no question of Germany being able to fight on at that point. That's just a question of how quickly can the Americans and the British, Canadians, and all the other allies, how quickly can they advance? Because that's pretty much where things were in January 1945. In 1945, they were all, everything was. That's irrelevant because there's no real meaningful road to victory except I think Hitler brings this up in one of his arguments to his generals that some radical shift in the alliance system that somehow or other that the Americans and the British are going to switch sides and fight along with Germany against communism and the Soviet Union. Yeah. And that's the kind of Hail Mary that period was generating.
But essentially, the economy didn't collapse until the US Air Force hammered the synthetic oil plants in late 1944 and 1945.
Pretty much 1944. I mean, I'm glad he brings it up. I mean, but pretty much by the beginning and the middle of 1944, an intensive bombing campaign against the synthetic fuel plants was conducted, and it was successful. I mean, there's no question about that. It crippled fuel production, synthetic fuel production.
And this whole oil crisis explains some of the other aspects of the war, including Hitler's stand-fast orders. People don't seem to understand Hitler's stand-fast orders. His generals were the most vocal on this subject, even going so far as to call him mad.
Well, yeah, the whole logic sort of comes from 1941, December 1941, when the Soviet counteroffensive, the winter counteroffensive in front of Moscow and later across the front, caused panic in the leadership as well as troops. And Hitler really galvanized determination to hang on and fight. And, that really worked. I mean, it prevented the panic from spreading, and it caused the lines to reform. And the problem with that is that then that became the go-to solution to any crisis on the front, is to just hold and don't make, just hold. Fight on at all costs, and that becomes a disastrous policy. Stalingrad is one of the classic examples, but I mean it pretty much applies across the war after this period, throughout the period after 1941.
Argument is convincing from a tactical point of view, but not from a strategic point of view. Hitler says he either takes Mayakop and Grozny or must end the war, and so he takes them and then holds on to them for dear life, hoping to simultaneously extract oil and starve the Soviets of oil. Where does he starve them of oil? The Volga at Stalingrad. Now, it can be argued that Stalingrad wasn't necessary for this. They could have gone south of the city and blocked the Volga there, and I agree. However, once committed at Stalingrad, Hitler's reasoning for standing fast in the Volga is kind of understandable, not just from a tactical point of view, but from a strategic point of view. He's trying to block the oil shipments up the Volga, and not withdrawing from the Caucasus makes sense because he's trying to extract the oil. There's also the promise from Manstein, who says he'll link up with the 6th Army, and then there's also Jesenek's indication that the Luftwaffe could supply the 6th Army by air. Anyway, it turns out to be a complete disaster, as we know. After this, though, why stand fast? Well, let's not forget who Hitler was. He had fought in the First World War, and so he does not want to repeat the stab-in-the-back surrender that caused the Germans to lose World War I.
Okay, so we're talking about the Soviet counteroffensive, the 42 counteroffensive that cuts off the 6th Army and basically breaks the front in the south. I don't understand how this reasoning is supposed to work. An army surrounded in Stalingrad certainly isn't helping the German cause. I don't know what he's trying to argue.
After World War I, the German opinion was that the German army had not been defeated in the field and had in fact been stabbed in the back by the government. Hitler, having lived through that war and having shared this opinion most vocally, is not willing to surrender in this second war for this reason. And in
I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. I'm really not sure where he wants to go with this.
1943 and 1944, the Germans are still fighting deep in Soviet territory. They are weak, but far from defeated. But now they have this critical oil crisis that prevents the movement of their motorised units. The German generals are suggesting that they should just move back in order to consolidate and then buy time for another counterattack.
You know, I'm not really sure what period he's talking about. I mean, again, the mechanized forces were fairly limited and fairly spread out. As a matter of fact, they got more spread out as time went on, which reflected a more defensive position. But the German generals weren't really in favor of a retreat per se. So, okay.
They're saying that they want to fight a manoeuvre war, and that's perfectly understandable. However, they are thinking from a tactical and operational point of view, not a strategic point of view. Their fuel supplies are inadequate. They can't fight the manoeuvre war that they want to. When you look at what...
Okay, that's you can fight a maneuver war with infantry, realistically. I mean, it depends on the tactical employment. It sounds to me like he's more or less taking the position that it sounds like the sort of the popular Hitler image of that all Hitler wanted was just hold everything and fight to the last man, which would have been disastrous. Well, basically was disastrous when it was done. Hopefully he clarifies that.
Hitler's saying, I shouldn't have listened to my generals. He's right. They wanted to go to Moscow, they wanted Leningrad, they wanted to retreat.
Okay, we're back to 1941, and yeah, the Moscow thing it's the only gamble that actually makes sense. I mean, the Leningrad is a sideshow, and frankly, and so is Ukraine. I mean, that's something to keep in mind. Is that but the South is full of resources, but I mean, it's either you win and get the resources, or you lose and you don't get the resources. That's kind of what it boils down to, and that's, they lost and they didn't get the resources. I think that's the key thing, and trying to go after the resources and just hold them isn't a sensible strategy. And insofar as retreating, it depends on what we're talking about, and this is very vague.
They were wrong. Generals like Manstein are relieved of command and replaced by generals who will...
Yeah, okay, I'm getting it. I mean, there's a famous battle that takes place after Stalingrad, so I think this is how that all just fits together in this presentation. Yeah, there's, the Soviet army is advancing, and Manstein basically lets them have Kharkov, I believe, and he just lets them advance until they've exhausted themselves, and outrun their supplies, which happens to armies. So again, it's not proof of a lack of capability, of logistics or anything else. It just happens that they were advancing, and they just kept advancing, and ultimately outrun their supplies. And at that point, the German forces strike back, and they end up retaking Kharkov, and the front stabilizes. And that pretty much is the setup for the summer of 1943. So yeah, so that's that side of it.
Stand and fight. About his dismissal, Manstein says that Hitler still had faith in him, but at the moment, however, there was no further scope for me in the East. The task now pending, he considered Model, who had stopped a difficult retreat in Northern Army Group, to be especially suitable.
Wow, okay. I've read his autobiography, which, dutifully, papers over or doesn't discuss, potential war crimes. But this section, it's actually pretty memorable. I'm not going to look it up. It's just dripping in sarcasm, right? And think about what he's writing here. Okay, I was told there's no need for me, and that another general would be far more suitable. Think about a senior German general and his thinking, right? I mean, and this guy's an aristocrat, a bit of a snob, and so forth, I'm sure. I'd never met the guy, though, so... but, I mean, seriously, it's dripping in sarcasm.
He goes on to say about the army group command he was handing over to Model. Its only remaining commitment was to assist the fighting troops and give them moral support. That Model would certainly be able to do.
In other words, the forces he was handing over were already lost, effectively. There was nothing to do. So I'm not sure why where he's going with this, but I mean, if you're trying to say that Manstein says this with approval, you're wrong. I mean, quite literally, you're wrong. Okay, this is like a slap in the face, basically.
2. The Führer empathically agreed that Model was a particularly suitable choice in this respect, as he would dash around the divisions and get the very most out of the troops. Manstein was the old manoeuvre warfare general, whereas Model was the type of defensive general who would stand and fight to the last.
Yeah, and standing to fight and fight to the last man is a terrible strategy. It's what caused so much grief to the Soviet Union in 1941, where an inflexibility insofar as withdrawals were concerned pretty much doomed many of the forces, because all they needed to do is keep cohesion, and the way to do that was to back away a little bit. And when the Germans started doing it, it's had the same disastrous results. So I don't know how that's seen as a reasonable perspective, but all right.
Last. This is why Model was known as the Führer's fireman, because he was constantly putting out fires throughout the Eastern Front. The point being that there was no fuel left to wage the manoeuvre war that Manstein was good at.
Okay, I don't think this is about maneuver warfare. It can't be done because there's no oil. It's the kind of war you're faced with now. I mean, one, it's pretty much a war of attrition at this point, and two, the unwillingness to give operational flexibility to the generals causes a lot of friction in the command system.
And that the war had moved to an attritional defensive battle stage. Hitler recognised that, and he also couldn't surrender, as stated. So, really, what choice does he have other than to stand and fight? He's playing for time because that's all he's got left, and he's...
Okay, I think, if I'm not wrong, Manstein is relieved in 1944 sometime, after the from one of the South Ukraine army groups or something, I believe. So we kind of jumped into 1944 without really getting into 1943, which pretty much skips a year. But I'm not really sure what the reasoning is at this point anymore.
He's hoping for miracles. That's not the thoughts of a madman. This is his only option. If he surrenders, he's dead. So he has to keep fighting. Given the situation strategically, this is his only option, and he's not mad for taking it. He's desperate and he's clutching at straws, but he's not mad. The oil crisis dictates that this has to happen. I also think it's interesting that up until late 1942, Hitler is mostly willing to listen to his generals and mostly willing to allow them to do what they think's best.
Okay, I'm not sure how you can relate all that's going on to an oil crisis that forces the Germans onto the defensive. It's like the overwhelming forces arrayed against them force them on the defensive, and that becomes apparently very, very apparent by 1943 as the Americans are landing in Sicily and Italy, ultimately leading to the Italian surrender and so forth, which are the topics he's mentioned. And so the thing is that I don't really see how oil factors into this. I mean, there are very big events taking place here, and it's like the oil isn't going to help. And I don't think it's oil advancing these events. It's the reality of the enormous forces arrayed against the German Axis.
Stalin is the opposite of this, and yet during the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin and Hitler seem to swap personalities. Hitler becomes less willing to listen to his generals and less willing to allow them the freedom of action they want. Stalin does start listening to his generals and does start allowing them to make their own decisions. It's as though both dictators realised at the same time that the tide had changed, that Hitler had lost the war and Stalin had won it. And it isn't just because of the fall of the Ukraine and the food or the coal or the other aspects. And it's not because the Wehrmacht was defeated. It was because Hitler had not taken the oil and not won the oil rush. And he had spent his last energies trying to get there. Once this is realised, both seem to swap roles.
Again, we're getting into one of these, you're just overstating, the case is being overstated here. There's no point in disputing that there's an oil shortage that constricts German potential. But there's so many other factors that come into play by the end of 1942. It's meaningless to talk about oil. German requirements, minimal requirements, are being met. By synthetic production, by the Romanian oil fields. I mean, it's like, like it or not, they're being met. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to continue fighting. Frankly, even a German infantry division was a pretty formidable force, and it was basically a non-mechanized force. Anyway, let's just see where he goes with the finale here.
And that to me is very interesting. There's obviously a lot of factors going on here, but that change of personality indicates that the time...
Yeah, see, that's the whole thing. There's a lot of factors. Oil, I find it very hard to even see how you can rank oil up there as one of the major factors. Anyway.
Tide of war had changed. Now, of course, Hitler had been stubborn before this, and sometimes his decisions don't seem to make much sense on the surface, such as Dunkirk.
Okay, Dunkirk. All right.
Why allow the British to withdraw from Dunkirk? Now, I'm going to hold my hand up in here and just say that I'm only suggesting that this is a factor. And I'm not saying this is the absolute 100% the only reason for this. I'm only suggesting that this should be factored in to the debate about Dunkirk. Okay, I'm going to suggest that some of the historians who say that Hitler did it for political reasons because he is trying to appease Britain may have been right. Why would he try and appease Britain? Britain, by fighting on, is no real threat to Germany, at least not by itself. Its army is small, they're struggling in North Africa against the Italians and then later Rommel and his 3 divisions, and its air force is good but not able to seriously hurt Germany at this time. But what the British have is the Royal Navy, and Hitler knows what they'll do with it. Blockade, just like they do with...
Um, yeah, it's not the blockade. Hitler doesn't fear the blockade because Hitler has the Nazi-Soviet pact. Let's remember, right? So in 1940, he's getting all the supplies he needs, and the British really don't represent a threat. But letting them go is a way of encouraging them to make peace, hoping, that's the hope. And that's, again, it always rolls back to there's nothing for Germany to gain by defeating, by invading the British Isles and forcing the government out. I think the British government planned to relocate to Canada if the islands were invaded, and I mean, that tells you everything. It's like, you know what, they were going to move across an ocean, and Germany doesn't have a navy adequate for taking possession of the British Empire. So, if the British lose the islands, the chances are that the colonial empire that they have and all the parts around it will gravitate more likely to the United States, which does have a navy. Some of it may be taken, preyed on by Japan, like they did with some of the French possessions in East Asia. So yeah, sure, it's not the blockade. It's the fact that there's nothing for Germany to gain, right? I mean, unlike the Soviet Union.
With the First World War, Germany is blockaded. Shipments of oil from the United States and Venezuela cease, and this is the ticking time bomb for Germany. This limits Germany's potential to win the war, resulting in the invasion of the Soviet Union. But if Hitler can appease the British or persuade them to come to peace, it would allow shipments of oil to keep coming into Germany and maybe buy him time to turn his army into a fully motorised and mechanised force. In this context, Dunkirk makes sense. Allow the British army to withdraw. It's not really a threat anyway, and we don't really want to invade England. And then try and get the British to accept peace. Perhaps this is why Hitler stopped the panzers. If the British can be persuaded to come to terms on the peace table, the blockade will be lifted and Germany will have access to more oil. Maybe.
Probably not, right? I mean, it's not the case that peace is going to lead to free trade, or that the Americans are even going to consider selling oil to Nazi Germany. I mean, that's and there's no worries about that, because the goal is, I think if the British had made peace and got, worth keeping in mind, there was an active pressure even after Churchill takes over. There is pressure to make peace because this is senseless. Britain is not in a position to win. Which is why when the invasion of the Soviet Union begins, it's like Churchill quips about, we're going to win this after all. I mean, it says everything. It's like there's no expectation for victory. And then there's still a fairly common expectation in 1941 that the Soviet Union will fall. Now, if you think about that in terms of the resources the Germans will get out of the Soviet Union, it's like actually you'll be in more trouble at the end of that. Regardless, the peace makes sense in and of itself.
Maybe this was for economic reasons. In his biography of Hitler, Kershaw suggests that this wasn't the case and that Dunkirk was in fact a purely military decision.
Kind of both, right? And as I said, I want to emphasize here that it is not about gaining access to imported oil from the United States or Venezuela or wherever else. That's not the point. The point of getting peace is to, one, turn on the Soviet Union, but and it's also what motivates the turn east anyway, is the lack of peace. So you can kind of wonder about whether or not if the British make peace, whether or not there's still going to be a war against the Soviet Union. But I'd say the odds are pretty good that there will be.
His rise and fall of the Third Reich, he has a debate about it, citing our beloved Halder over and over again, and seems puzzled when some generals suggest that Hitler was happy to let the British Empire live on. Halder, of course, says Hitler was at fault and that it was his military decision, although admits that there were second political decisions and reasons as well. Halder blames Goering and sides with Rundstedt, who says he wasn't the one who sided with Hitler, even though he did, and there's other generals as well that seem to be on Hitler's side in one account and then not in another, and it's a whole... The debate goes on, it's a massive mess. And really, it does deserve a video on its own, but I'm going to suggest that Hitler had the oil situation in the back of his mind as well. And in that context, it adds weight to the idea that Hitler was trying to appease the British.
That makes no sense. I mean, the reasoning here, if I understand correctly, is that Hitler was in favor of not destroying the British troops at Dunkirk because that might lead to peace, which might lead to a resumption of oil trade or oil imports. Yeah, I can't say that's a very credible position. It's really not about the oil.
In that sense, he does not need victory, he just needs peace. Again, I'm just suggesting that this was a factor, not necessarily the only factor.
Well, it's not a very convincing argument, but I'm going to see what he's got to present in the wrap-up.
90% of the world oil supplies were controlled by the Allies. So deficient were the Axis powers of oil, they were willing to wage war to obtain it. This was the Axis Achilles heel. The British decision to keep fighting in 1940 results in a blockade of Europe that...
Yeah, okay, again, blockade, not really relevant certainly for oil, because the Germans were getting it thanks to the Nazi-Soviet pact from the Soviet Union.
Prevents oil from getting to Germany. Hitler is therefore forced to fight a war with the Soviet Union, which doesn't collapse in 1941.
Okay, yeah, there's this tension here that's it's like, well, okay, so there's a lack of oil for Germany, but I mean, a lack of oil, why do you say that? Because it's not got access to American oil, which is being blockaded by the British. Okay, fair enough, but the Soviet Union is providing oil, and they're providing as much as they probably can. So Germany is forced to invade the Soviet Union. They're not forced to, but it's it's a more reasonable choice.
As expected, but keeps fighting. This forces Hitler to gamble in striking towards the Caucasus in 1942 in one last attempt to get to the oil that he needs to wage the war.
Yeah, okay. The Soviets don't collapse, and in part you can blame that on the turn south that's talked about on the road to Moscow. That's why the plan is never executed, because that's a move that's basically reflective of a war of attrition objective, securing more supplies, when in fact what you really needed was to secure a political defeat of the Soviet Union and bring about the collapse of the army as a result of that, or some variant of that. But the fact is, I mean, that's the big gamble that the German generals basically saw in this war. The strike to the Caucasus is just, it's more of the same. Going for the Caucasus wasn't a meaningfully useful objective. It was a terrible plan reflecting a hopeless situation, and it wasn't a good bet.
It's prevented from doing so by what happens at Stalingrad. After this point, Hitler's only real choice is to fight and buy him as much time as possible leading to an increasing use of stand-fast orders.
See, okay, I think there's a real misunderstanding of the stand-fast orders, and, I don't see how oil can, I know that he's saying it, but it's like, it's not very convincing, it's not convincing at all that oil is central to this.
Germany didn't need more panzers or trucks or submarines or planes because it couldn't run the ones it had. Oil is probably not the only factor, but it is a big one.
Okay, see, now that's good for him. It's not the only factor, and yeah, there's certainly others, and so are really poor decisions. A large part of the presentation is making a case that oil is the main factor. Okay? Not necessarily the only factor, but the main factor that drives all this. But I don't find convincing that it provides debilitating loss of mobility on the part of the German forces, and it doesn't seem to have impacted the economy of occupied Europe and Allied Europe, Nazi-Allied Europe, in a manner that seems to be argued. So, if oil is so important, then why is it not really working the way is being argued here? I think that's the problem here. So,
when you think of World War II, you should think of oil. It explains the war, it explains why one side won and one side lost, it explains the post-war world, why Britain is no longer a superpower, but the Soviets and the USA are, and it explains many of the decisions made at the time, and even since. Do you agree?
Yeah, I don't agree, obviously, and I mean, to go into the post-war side, I mean, the British lost their status. Well, I mean, they didn't immediately. It just became sort of evident over time as they gave up on various things, like in Greece, for example, and simply started withdrawing because it just wasn't affordable anymore. But I don't think it was really about the oil. I mean, it's just massive resources, continental-sized resources, which is something that the Soviet Union had, and it's something the United States had. Germany was kind of on the cusp in 1940 in terms of the, array of allies and occupied territories that it controlled. It was on the cusp of achieving superpower status. But it, to quote one of my favorite movies, there could be only one. And it was either going to be Germany or it was going to be the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union already had the resources, and World War II simply solidified that position. But they certainly couldn't have done that without the active support of the British and the Americans. So anyway, I think that's about all I've got to say about this. It's not bad, but it really overstates the case about oil. There is a case to make, but it's not this big a case. I think that's the important thing to be mindful of.